Now that your first constructives have been posted for you all to see, I want you to choose one of those, first come, first serve kind of a thing, and then create a counter argument, or what we're going to call a refutation to that. Um, Take a look at their thesis, at their proposition, and at their case, and go through and create an argument against that, and then record the argument again, your refutation, and post it onto your blog. But to do so, I want to introduce to you a couple of ideas here in arguing. And you're going to argue one of two ways. You're going to either argue against the content of the case itself, or against the case, the logic of the case, the content or the logic. So there's two areas I want to get into. The first area that I want to talk about is arguing against the content. And one of the main ways you can do that is through a method called turning the tables. And this means that you're adopting your opposing argument and turning it so you use it against the case. So it takes an argument and it uses it to bolster the position of your position in refutation. Okay, so for example, here in Dallas, tragically, we had last week a shooting that broke out during a peaceful rally in response to the deaths of two black men at the hands of two white police officers. If you're not familiar with it, look it up and see what's going on. I'm so tired of these stories. Anyway, what's interesting about this whole Dallas issue was back in January, Texas passed a open carry law. They embraced the Second Amendment to that point of open carry, where law-abiding citizens can carry their weapons out in the open. Okay, so that law was introduced under the auspices that with weapons out in the open, it would make the public feel safer. So they, a few nights ago, they had this rally, and people showed up, much like what you're seeing here in this image, toting along weapons. They're assault-style weapons that are carried with a sling around their shoulders this way, and then revolvers on their hips, that kind of thing. The problem with this is that this guy here showed up doing the same thing. And shortly after the shooting, the Dallas PD released a photo of this man, and they were searching for him as a person of interest in connection with the killing. And during a press conference, the police said that this man was carrying an AR-15 rifle and was wearing camouflage gear, and so obviously he was going to be a suspect in what was going on. This guy here his name is Mark Hughes, and Mark happens to be the brother of the protest organizer Corey Hughes. So as soon as Mark found out that he was a person of interest by the Dallas Police Department, he turned himself in. And surrendered his gun to the first police officer he can come to and said, look, it's not me, it wasn't me. So by carrying the weapon in complete legal obedience to the law there, the tables turned on him, where he became suddenly a person of a suspect in the shooting of what was going on there. And he was wrong place, wrong time, with the wrong weapon strapped around his body. So this turns the tables on the notion that open carry increases public safety. Next is the concept of reducing to the absurd. Now remember, we're talking about case content here, okay? So reducing to the absurd requires taking up an argument of the opposing viewpoint as if it were true, and then showing how that leads to an absurdity. And again, since guns are in the news so much here lately, there's an ad that was put out by the States United to Prevent Gun Violence. And the ad goes through and shows, you can find this on YouTube, you can look it up. This man enters this office area, he's carrying a musket, and he finds his target, he pulls the trigger, he misses because these weapons were not ever accurate really to begin with. And then it shows him actually reloading the musket. Now, this is a gun that upon which the Second Amendment was written. And so what they're doing here is reducing to an absurdity the idea of that current guns remain aloof from what the Second Amendment is really trying to go through and empower that way. Next is reducing the argument down to a dilemma. So here it's possible to take your opposing viewpoint and take that down into two alternatives and then disprove each of those two positions. And there are a number of ways you can go through and interpret this. So the main thing is that you take the argument, you break it down into uh, two positions, and then you discredit those two positions. Here in Utah, we have this crazy, interesting law called the Zion Curtain, where establishments who want a liquor license have to raise a barrier between the patrons and where they're actually mixing drinks. And I'm not sure really what the reasoning is behind this, but we can reduce this down into a dilemma of a couple of different things and then dismiss the argument. One might be that you don't know what's going into the drink since you can't see it mixed, behind the Zion Curtain, and therefore you might not want to frequent that establishment as a result of that. So suddenly now the establishment starts losing revenue as a result. So we've taken the law, reduced it down into two dilemmas here: not knowing what's going into your drink and perhaps the establishment losing revenue. And then that the law becomes bad for business in that respect. The last idea here in terms of attacking content is reducing that content down to its residue. And residues are like a dilemma, only that the proposition is divided into all of its possibilities or impossibilities, as the case might be, and then we start to eliminate those false or undesirable outcomes, and the only true or the best possibility is left standing. So here in the United States, there's a popular notion that if you're Muslim, you also must be a terrorist, or you must be associated with terrorism on some level, or at the very least sympathetic to terrorism. So again, here this past week, the Prophet's Mosque in the city of Medina was attacked by no less than the Islamic State. The Islamic State attacked the mosque, the resting place of the great Prophet Muhammad. And there's no, it's an attack on Islam. And so for people to hold onto the notion that Muslims actually embrace this whole concept of what the Islamic State is trying to do is reduced down to its residues. If the Islamic State is going through and desecrating the grave of Muhammad, how could they possibly have that link or that tie to Muslims, or how could Muslims have that tie back to the Islamic State? So that reduces the argument down to its residue in that respect. All right. So those are, 4 or 5 ideas. I'm sorry, the fifth one coming up here is enforcing the consequences. Here, this is like reducing to an absurdity where you take the argument and you show that if it's carried out to its logical conclusion, that the results are undesirable or that they are illogical. So here not too long ago, the state of North Carolina passed House Bill, I think it was 121, requiring a number of things having to do with using a public restroom, not the least of which was producing a birth certificate that proved your gender. And there's lots of things here that become illogical in terms of enforcing these consequences. And it also, in enforcing these consequences, it would start to go through and infringe on or inhibit certain civil rights that we would be surrendering as a result of that. So in looking at that case, we can go through and look at if we enforce those consequences, then the outcome would be people denied their rights, or the fact that it's just kind of plain silly for you to show your birth certificate to prove your gender if you have to use the bathroom. All kinds of arguments can stem up through this. And none of these that we've talked about so far are really mutually exclusive. A lot of them can overlap in terms of how we go through and fight against the content of the case or of the constructive that way. So we've already talked about these. The arguments that go against the case deal with fallacies, okay? And we've gone through a couple of dozen of these in a previous video. I'm going to go through and recap just probably some of the most maybe pertinent ones to the cases that I've seen so far from you in class. And if you want, you can kind of connect the dots there and see what might be relevant as you go through and try to refute a case and see what's going on. So remember, the ones before this deal with the content of the case. These deal with the logic of the case, all right? The first one being the hasty generalization, the sweeping generalization. These are they imply that absolute situations exist and they don't, okay? Reality happens in degrees. So if you're coming across terms in a case like all or always or everybody or nobody or none, chances are then there's a sweeping generalization in there, and you can attack the case on its logic based on this kind of thinking. Like everyone has fond memories of high school, men are better at sports than women, or all advertising is lies. All three of these are hasting or sweeping generalizations, and you might find these prevalent in some of the cases that are out there. Next is false extremes, where we get into forcing what's called the dichotomy, the either or position. If the case reduces a complex issue down to two possibilities, then you could probably induce this fallacy. Okay? Very rarely is anything black or white. It becomes misleading because it ignores the existence of other less extreme possibilities that are going on. Okay? Next is the circular reasoning, the vicious cycle. There's a couple cases out there that could be critiqued on this level in terms of its logic. This error occurs when a person restates a generalization as a reason for accepting the same proposition, like exercise is healthy because your body needs exercise, or the play was popular because the audience liked it. Next are post hoc arguments. This error occurs when a person assumes that because one thing followed another thing, that first thing caused the second thing to happen. There's no logic involved here. It's more superstition than anything. So it becomes what's called a post hoc argument. Okay, might want to take a look at if that exists within the first constructive case that you are critiquing. False analogies. Analogies can make strong emotional appeals, but the logic within them might be weak, and so you might want to make sure that logic makes a connection there. Okay, that analogy is only effective when there is a basic similarity between those compared terms that way. Okay. Very rarely can we accurately predict any kind of consequences going on. So if you see that kind of prediction happening within a case, it deserves your scrutiny that way. And lastly, and probably one of the most popular, is this concept of non sequitur, or meaning that it just doesn't make any sense. Okay, it does not follow. So if there's something that does not make sense, is nonsensical within the case, then this becomes that fallacious critique for that. All right. So that's what I'm looking for you to do. These are the two different levels: an argument against the content of the case, or an argument against the logic of the case, as you construct your refutation. Now, you would probably use the same format, okay, the same outline that we used for the first constructive, this one just being an opposition. So you're going to go through and restate the proposition, and then go through and take it apart, okay, including the claim, the warrant, the solvency that's happening within that case.